We've decided to give your college fund to Tyler. My mother said it so casually, standing at the kitchen counter slicing vegetables for dinner, that for a moment I thought I'd misheard her. I was 18 years old, sitting at the worn wooden table where I'd done my homework for the past 12 years, and I had my acceptance letter to Carnegie Mellon University folded in my pocket, the paper already soft from how many times I'd opened it to make sure it was real. My father sat across from me with his coffee, not quite meeting my eyes, and my brother Tyler lounged against the refrigerator scrolling through his phone, barely paying attention to the conversation that was quietly destroying my future. "What?" I managed to say, and I was proud that my voice came out steady, that I didn't let them see the way my chest had suddenly tightened, the way the room seemed to tilt slightly to the left. "Tyler needs it more than you do, honey," my mother continued, and the knife made that steady thunking sound against the cutting board, rhythmic and unmoved. "You've always been so naturally smart, everything comes easy to you. But Tyler has to work harder for his grades, and we think he needs the extra support." I looked at my brother, 16 years old and smirking slightly at his phone, his last report card a collection of C's and one generous B- in gym class. I had a 4.3 GPA. I was valedictorian. I had spent 4 years in every advanced placement class our school offered, studying until 2 in the morning, tutoring other students for extra money, building a transcript that would open doors. Carnegie Mellon had accepted me into their business program, one of the best in the country, and I'd been planning how to make the college fund stretch to cover what my partial academic scholarship didn't. "Tyler hasn't even applied to colleges yet," I said quietly, and my father finally spoke up, his voice carrying that tone of finality that meant the decision was already made, had probably been made weeks ago without anyone thinking to include me in the conversation. "He's been looking at State. It's a good school. He'll do fine there with the right support. State University, where the acceptance rate was 92%, and Tyler's mediocre grades would be more than sufficient. The college fund my parents had started when I was born, that I'd been counting on, that I'd planned around, was going to send my younger brother to a school he could get into without any effort at all, while I would have to figure out how to cover $30,000 a year on my own." "I see," I said, and I did see, clearly, the pattern that had been forming my entire childhood suddenly crystallizing into perfect, painful clarity. Tyler needed more help, more attention, more money, more grace, because things didn't come naturally to him, and I would be fine because I always was. I folded my hands on the table and felt something hardening inside my chest, something that felt like determination wrapped around a core of hurt. "I'll figure it out myself then." My mother glanced at me with a smile that was probably meant to be encouraging. "You always do, honey." Before continuing the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers to be able to bring you stories like this every day. For you, it's just a click, but for me, it means a lot. That moment in the kitchen wasn't the first time I'd been invisible in my own family. It was just the first time the cost had been measured in dollars and dreams. And sitting there watching my mother's knife work through those vegetables while my future got reallocated to my younger brother, I found myself remembering Tyler's 16th birthday with perfect, painful clarity. He'd gotten a car, a nearly new Honda Civic with only 8,000 miles on it, silver with leather seats and a sound system. He spent the entire party demonstrating to his friends, and I remembered standing in the driveway watching him show it off, thinking about the 1997 Toyota Camry with 160,000 miles that I'd been driving for the past year, the one with the broken air conditioning and the passenger door that stuck, the one my parents had said was perfectly fine for getting around town when I'd asked if there might be something a bit more reliable for driving to my after-school job. Tyler had been mediocre that entire year academically, a C student who'd been suspended once for skipping class. And yet there he was accepting keys to a $12,000 vehicle while our parents beamed at him like he'd cured cancer. I'd made honor roll every semester since 6th grade. When I'd gotten my acceptance to the National Honor Society junior year, my mother had said, "That's nice, honey," without looking up from the television show she was watching. But when Tyler had brought home a C+ in English that same week, a grade that meant he'd barely avoided failing, my father had taken him out for ice cream to celebrate his improvement. The pattern had always been there, woven into the fabric of our family dynamics so completely that I'd learned to expect it the way you expect winter after fall, inevitable and cold. Christmas mornings had been studies in inequality. Tyler's pile of presents always noticeably larger than mine, more expensive, more thought out, more everything. And when I'd been 12 and asked why Tyler got the new gaming system and 3 games while I got clothes and a book, my mother had explained that Tyler needed more to keep him motivated, that I was self-driven and didn't require external rewards the way he did. I'd learned early that achievement was my currency, the only way to get even a fraction of the attention Tyler received simply for existing, so I'd collected accomplishments like other kids collected baseball cards, building a resume of excellence that I'd thought would eventually make them see me. Debate team captain, science fair winner 3 years running, volunteer at the hospital, president of student council. None of it had mattered the way Tyler's barely passing grades seemed to matter, the way his struggles became family emergencies while my successes became background noise. So when I sat at that kitchen table and told my parents I'd figure out college funding myself, I already knew what I'd hear, and my mother's response landed exactly where I'd expected it to, in that space inside me that had learned not to need them anymore. "You always do, honey," she'd said, and my father had finally looked up from his newspaper long enough to nod before returning to the sports section, and I'd understood with absolute certainty that I was on my own, that I had always been on my own, and that the only person who would ever fight for my future was me. I became intimately familiar with exhaustion that spring, the kind that settled into your bones and made even simple decisions feel like complex mathematics. And by the time graduation approached, I was working 3 jobs simultaneously while sending out scholarship applications like desperate prayers into an uncaring void. The waitressing shift at Romano's Italian restaurant ran from 5 to 11 on weeknights, and I'd arrive home smelling like garlic and marinara sauce with my feet screaming and my pockets full of singles and fives that I'd count out on my bed, sorting them into envelopes labeled tuition, books, housing, food. Weekday afternoons I tutored at the Learning Center downtown, helping middle school students with algebra and chemistry, subjects that came easily to me even when I was running on 4 hours of sleep and too much coffee. And Saturday mornings I opened at the Gap in the mall, folding clothes and managing the fitting rooms and smiling at customers, while my mind calculated how many more shifts I'd need to cover the gap between my partial scholarship and Carnegie Mellon's total cost of attendance. The number was $42,000 for the first year. My savings account had $6,000 in it. I applied for every scholarship I could find, spending my Sunday afternoons in the library going through databases and filling out applications, writing essays about my goals and my challenges and what made me deserving of financial support. And some nights I'd fall asleep at the kitchen table with my laptop still open, waking up at 2 in the morning with keyboard marks on my cheek and another application deadline approaching. It was during one of those marathon scholarship sessions that Tyler came home with his acceptance letter to State University, waving it around like he'd achieved something extraordinary, and my parents erupted into celebration, my mother actually crying with joy, and my father opening a bottle of champagne they'd been saving, and I sat at that same kitchen table with my scholarship applications spread around me like evidence of everything they couldn't be bothered to notice. They threw Tyler a party 3 weeks later, invited all the relatives and his friends, ordered a cake with "Congratulations, Tyler" written in blue frosting, and I worked a double shift at Romano's that day and came home to find the celebration in full swing. Tyler holding court in the living room while people congratulated him on his achievement, on his bright future, on getting into college like it was some kind of miracle instead of a statistical inevitability given State's acceptance rate. I stood in the doorway still wearing my work shirt and watched my mother hug him, And I thought about the college fund that had been mine, that was now paying for Tyler's mediocrity to continue for 4 more years, and I felt something shift inside me, something that felt less like anger and more like clarity. My best friend Maya found me in my room an hour later, having let herself in through the back door the way she'd been doing since we were 12, and she took one look at my face and the scholarship applications I'd returned to and sat down on my bed without saying anything for a long moment. "How much sleep did you get last night?" she finally asked, and I had to think about it before answering. 4 hours, maybe less. And she told me I couldn't keep going like this, that I was going to burn out before I even got to college. But my pride wouldn't let me admit how close to breaking I really was. How some mornings I woke up and didn't know if I could face another day of working and applying and being invisible in my own home, while Tyler's averageness got celebrated like excellence. Carnegie Mellon in August felt like stepping into a different universe, one where my ambition wasn't unusual and my exhaustion was shared by everyone around me. But the relief of arrival was tempered by the reality of my financial situation, which meant that while other freshmen were decorating dorm rooms and making friends at orientation events, I was filling out paperwork for 2 campus jobs and sending messages to freelance coding platforms to build a client base before classes even started. My double major in business and computer science was ambitious. Everyone said so. But I'd learned that ambition was the only currency I had, the only thing that had ever belonged completely to me, and I attacked my course load with the same focused intensity I'd brought to funding my presence there in the first place, studying in gaps between my shifts at the library information desk and my evening job at the campus coffee shop, writing code for small business websites at 2 in the morning when my roommate was asleep and the dorm was finally quiet. I called home every Sunday because that seemed like what you were supposed to do, and those conversations followed a pattern that became so predictable I could have scripted them in advance. My mother answering with immediate questions about how Tyler was adjusting to state, whether I'd heard from him, what I thought about his classes, and only after that topic had been thoroughly exhausted would she ask how I was doing, a question that expected a brief answer. And when I mentioned my workload or my jobs, she'd make a sympathetic sound that conveyed no actual sympathy before returning to concerns about whether Tyler was eating enough vegetables in the dining hall. My father rarely got on the phone, and when he did, his contribution consisted of asking if my grades were good, a question that assumed they would be because they always were, and then he'd tell me Tyler was thinking about joining a fraternity, and did I think that was a good idea? As if I had any bandwidth to worry about my brother's social life when I was running on 5 hours of sleep and surviving on ramen and whatever free food I could find at campus events. Thanksgiving freshman year should have been a relief, a chance to sleep in my own bed and eat real food, and maybe, possibly, have my parents notice that I'd survived a semester of the kind of academic and work schedule that would have broken most people. But when I walked into the house and climbed the stairs to my bedroom, I found it transformed into something I didn't recognize. My bed replaced with a leather gaming chair and an expensive desk setup, my bookshelf gone, posters of games and movies I'd never chosen covering walls that used to hold my debate team certificates and honor roll awards. "You're barely here anyway," my mother explained, when she found me standing in the doorway of what used to be my space, and she said it so casually, like it was reasonable, like the fact that I'd left for college meant I'd forfeited any claim to a place in this house, and I understood then with perfect clarity that I wasn't just financially independent anymore, I was completely untethered from this family, and instead of devastating me the way it might have a year earlier, that realization felt almost like permission. Like I could finally stop waiting for them to see me and just focus on building something they couldn't ignore. Sophomore year arrived with the confidence that comes from having survived the worst, and I threw myself into my double major with the kind of focus that made my professors take notice, spending my evenings at networking events for the tech industry, where I learned to speak the language of venture capital and market disruption. And it was during one of those events that I met David Chen, a senior who was developing inventory management software and needed someone who understood both the business applications and the technical back end. And within 2 weeks, we were meeting at coffee shops, to map out what would eventually become TechStream Solutions, though we didn't know to call it that yet. I discovered something about myself during those late nights of coding and analysis, something that went beyond my ability to work hard or solve problems, and it was this. I could see gaps in the market that other people missed, inefficiencies in systems that everyone else accepted as inevitable, and I understood instinctively how to build solutions that businesses would actually pay for instead of interesting technology nobody needed. My junior year became a blur of classes and internships at tech companies in Pittsburgh, positions I'd fought for and won despite competition from students whose parents had made phone calls or whose family friends sat on boards. And every Sunday evening, I'd call home and listen to my mother talk about Tyler, who had switched his major from business to communications and then to general studies, who was struggling to maintain the 2.5 GPA required to keep his housing, who needed extra money for textbooks or food or expenses that my parents sent without question, while I was eating ramen for the fourth night in a row and debugging code until 3 in the morning. The summer before my senior year, David and I applied for Carnegie Mellon's Innovation Grant Program, a competitive process that provided seed funding for student ventures with commercial potential, and I spent 2 weeks preparing our pitch, building financial projections and market analysis, and a working prototype that I'd coded during finals week when I should have been sleeping. And when we stood in front of that panel of professors and local investors in July, I felt something click into place, a certainty that this was what I was meant to be doing. And when they awarded us $15,000 in funding, I called home to share the news, and my mother answered with, "That's wonderful, honey, but I can't talk long. Tyler just got home and I'm making his favorite dinner. You know he's been having such a hard time with his grades." I didn't ask for congratulations. I'd learned by then not to expect what they couldn't give. But I had something better than their approval. I had proof that my vision was worth something to people who understood value, and that seed grant felt like a doorway opening, and I walked through it without looking back, without waiting for permission from people who had never seen me clearly enough to know what I was building. Senior year arrived with the kind of momentum that made everything feel inevitable. And David and I spent the fall refining TechStream Solutions, our inventory management software that had evolved from a class project into something that actual businesses wanted to pay for, meeting with potential clients and investors while I juggled my final coursework and somehow managed to maintain the 4.0 GPA I'd carried for 7 semesters. And in March, we pitched at Carnegie Mellon's annual venture competition, standing in front of a room full of investors and entrepreneurs and professors, and I felt the electricity of knowing we had something real when a venture capitalist named Robert Martinez approached us afterward with talk of seed funding and growth potential and terms that would let us launch immediately after graduation. Tyler graduated from State that same May with a 2.7 GPA and a degree in general business, and my parents rented a party tent for the backyard and invited what seemed like half the neighborhood, my mother crying proud tears, and my father making a speech about how Tyler had found his path and they'd always believed in him. And when my graduation came 2 weeks later, my mother called 4 days before to say they couldn't make it because Tyler had a job interview that day in Philadelphia, and they wanted to drive him there for moral support, and could I maybe record the ceremony or something so they could watch it later? I told her not to worry about it. I told her I understood. I didn't tell her that I'd graduated summa cum laude, or that I was receiving the Computer Science Department's Achievement Award, or that I'd be walking across that stage with job offers from Google and Amazon and Microsoft sitting in my email inbox, offers with starting salaries that would have seemed like fantasy money to the 18-year-old girl who'd worked 3 jobs to fund her first semester. Because what was the point of sharing accomplishments with people who had never learned to see them? Maya's family came instead, her parents and her little sister, and they cheered when my name was called and took photos afterward and treated me to dinner at a nice restaurant. And Maya's mother hugged me and said, "Your parents don't know what they're missing." And I loved her for saying it, even though we both knew my parents knew exactly what they were missing and had simply decided Tyler's mediocre job interview mattered more. The day after graduation, I signed the term sheet with Robert Martinez's firm, accepting $250,000 in venture capital funding in exchange for 20% equity in TechStream Solutions. And just like that, I wasn't a student anymore. I was the CEO of my own company. 22 years old with a prestigious degree I'd funded myself and a business plan that investors believed in, and absolutely no safety net because I'd turned down every salaried position to bet everything on my own vision. And when I called home to tell my parents I'd started a company, my father said, "That's nice, Jessica, very ambitious," in the same tone he'd used to comment on the weather. And then he asked if I'd heard that Tyler got hired at a sales firm in King of Prussia, and wasn't that wonderful news? The first 2 years of running TechStream Solutions taught me what exhaustion really meant, the kind that goes beyond physical tiredness into something that lives in your bones. And I was 22 years old eating ramen noodles in a studio apartment in Pittsburgh that cost $800 a month and still felt like a luxury I could barely afford, because every dollar that wasn't going to basic survival was being poured back into the company, into server costs and software licenses, and the 2 developers I'd managed to hire at salaries that were embarrassingly low, but were all I could offer along with equity that might someday be worth something if we didn't fail like 90% of startups do in their first 2 years. I worked 100-hour weeks that blurred together into one continuous stream of code and client meetings and pitch sessions with potential investors, sleeping on the couch in our cramped office more nights than I slept in my own bed. And slowly, painfully, we started gaining clients, small businesses that took a chance on our inventory management system, and then told other small businesses. And by the time I turned 24, we were finally turning a profit, modest but real, enough that I could pay myself an actual salary of $42,000 a year and feel like a millionaire, even though I was still driving the same used Honda I'd bought junior year of college. Tyler, during those same 2 years, bounced between entry-level sales positions like he was testing mattresses, quitting one after 4 months because the manager didn't appreciate his talents, getting let go from another after 6 months for missing quota, complaining at family dinners I occasionally attended that these jobs were beneath him, that he deserved better, that the corporate world didn't understand people like him. And my parents nodded sympathetically and continued depositing money into his account every month to supplement whatever income he was or wasn't earning. And when Tyler turned 24, the same age I was, he was still living in their basement, and they were still paying his car insurance and cell phone bill and treating him like a recent graduate who just needed time to find his footing instead of a grown man who had never learned to stand on his own. I made the mistake of attending a family dinner that November, one of maybe 4 times that year I'd driven the 2 hours home. And Tyler spent the entire meal complaining about how the job market was impossible and companies didn't value loyalty anymore. And my parents murmured agreement and asked sympathetic questions. And when there was finally a break in the Tyler show, I mentioned that TechStream was doing well, that we'd just signed our biggest client yet, and my father looked at me with that distant smile he'd perfected over the years and said, "That's nice, Jessica. Very ambitious of you." And then, without taking a breath, he turned to Tyler and said, "Your mother and I have been talking, and we think you should consider graduate school, maybe get your MBA. We'd be happy to help with tuition." And something inside me that had still been hoping for recognition just quietly closed. And I stopped sharing details of my life with them after that. Stopped waiting for them to ask the right questions. Because I finally understood that no achievement would ever be enough to shift their focus from the son who needed everything to the daughter who had learned to need nothing from them. 3 years after graduation, TechStream Solutions had grown from a bootstrapped startup into a company valued at $8 million, with 23 employees and clients in 17 states. And I was still driving that same used Honda and living in a modest apartment because every dollar beyond basic survival went back into expansion and infrastructure and hiring people who were smarter than me in their specific domains. And I'd learned that building something real meant delayed gratification on a scale my 25-year-old self hadn't quite anticipated. But my 18-year-old self, who'd worked 3 jobs, would have understood perfectly. Tyler, at 25, had just been fired from his fourth sales job in 3 years, this time for what my mother delicately described as personality conflicts with management, when she called me on a Tuesday afternoon, and I could hear the worry in her voice when she said, "Jessica, I know you have your little company, and I was wondering if maybe you could put in a good word for Tyler somewhere. Maybe one of your business contacts needs someone." And the phrase little company hung in the air like she was describing a lemonade stand instead of a business that had generated 2.3 million in revenue the previous year. But I just said I'd keep my ears open and left it deliberately vague because I wasn't ready to reveal exactly how not little my company had become. Maya was my COO now, a title that came with equity and a salary that let her pay off her student loans. And we were planning a major expansion that would require hiring an entire sales team. And when she suggested we implement a formal hiring process with blind resume reviews to avoid unconscious bias, I agreed because it was good practice and also because I'd been intentionally maintaining a low profile as CEO, using my middle name Clark in most business contexts and letting Maya handle the public-facing aspects of the company while I focused on product development and strategy. And it wasn't that I was hiding exactly, but more that I'd learned I could be more effective when I wasn't constantly performing the role of young female CEO for every journalist and conference organizer who wanted to write that particular narrative. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd built something worth $8 million, and my parents still thought I had some kind of office job, some modest position that was fine for someone like me who'd always been self-sufficient, while Tyler's series of failed sales positions were treated like temporary setbacks for someone destined for greatness. And I thought about the college fund they'd given him, the $58,000 that could have changed my life at 18, but that I'd learned to live without, and how that money had funded a mediocre degree that led to a series of jobs he couldn't keep while I'd turned nothing into something by working twice as hard as everyone around me. And I realized I wasn't angry about it anymore. I was just tired of the fundamental unfairness of being invisible to the people who were supposed to see me first. Tyler's application landed on my desk on a Wednesday morning in March, except it didn't actually land on my desk because we had a proper HR department now with Lauren heading recruitment, and she brought it to Maya first because Maya handled all the department head decisions, and Maya walked into my office with a paper resume in her hand and an expression I couldn't quite read, and said, "You need to see this." And when I looked at the name typed at the top in Arial font, I felt something cold settle in my stomach, even though I'd known this was possible ever since my mother had asked me to help him find something. Tyler James Morrison, the resume read, and it detailed his mediocre career with responsibilities that were probably inflated and achievements that were likely exaggerated, but our company policy that I'd insisted on was blind resume review focused on potential rather than just experience. And apparently, Tyler had made it through the first screening and then performed adequately enough in the initial phone interview to land in the final candidate pool for a junior sales associate position. And Maya was looking at me with a question in her eyes that was really a dozen questions about ethics and family and whether we could be objective about this. I used my middle name Clark in all business contexts, had kept an intentionally low media profile because I'd learned early that being a young female CEO meant endless think pieces and patronizing interviews, and I'd told myself it was about work-life balance, but maybe part of it had been about keeping these worlds separate, about having something that was mine that my family couldn't diminish. And now those worlds were colliding in the form of a 3-page resume that spelled my brother's name across the top in slightly too large font, like he was compensating for the thin content below. "What do you want to do?" Maya asked, and I could hear the subtext, could hear her asking if I wanted her to quietly remove his application, to save me from this complication, and I was tempted for maybe 30 seconds to do exactly that. But then I thought about all the things I'd built this company to be, about merit and fairness, and the policies we'd implemented specifically to prevent favoritism, and I realized that removing his application because of who he was would be just as unfair as accepting it for the same reason. "Let the process play out," I told Maya. "If he's genuinely qualified, he gets hired. If he's not, he doesn't." Same as anyone else. Maya nodded slowly, understanding what I was really saying, which was that I needed to know if Tyler could actually earn something on his own. If stripped of our parents' support and his own inflated self-assessment, he had any real capability. And also, maybe I needed to see him in an environment where I held the power, where the dynamic that had defined our entire childhood was completely inverted. And I wasn't proud of that last part, but I was self-aware enough to admit it existed. Tyler went through 2 more interviews, and I watched one of them from my office through the glass wall that overlooked the main floor. Watched him in his ill-fitting suit that our parents had probably bought him, using hand gestures that were too broad and laughing too loud at things that weren't funny, but also answering questions with adequate competence, demonstrating basic sales knowledge, being just good enough to justify a yes. And when Lauren came to me with the final hiring recommendations, and Tyler's name was on the list, I signed off on it, and felt something that might have been anticipation, or might have been dread, or might have been the ghost of my 18-year-old self whispering that justice takes unexpected forms. Tyler's first 3 months at TechStream Solutions were a study in adequacy, which is to say he was neither exceptional enough to promote nor incompetent enough to fire. And I watched from my office with its glass walls that let me observe the entire floor while remaining largely unnoticed myself. Watched him arrive each morning at 8:57 for a 9 o'clock start. Watched him take long lunches and leave promptly at 5. Watched him coast on the efforts of the team while taking credit in ways that were just subtle enough to avoid direct confrontation. And I realized this was who he'd always been. Except now I was seeing it in a professional context where the consequences of mediocrity were supposed to matter. He started attending family dinners again, the ones I mostly avoided but occasionally forced myself to endure. And during one in late June, I sat at the same dining room table where they'd told me about the college fund 7 years earlier and watched Tyler hold court about his job at this incredible tech company that was really going places. And my mother was beaming at him with the kind of pride I'd stopped hoping to see directed at me. And my father was nodding along as Tyler described the company's inventory management software with complete confidence and almost complete inaccuracy, explaining features that didn't exist and misunderstanding fundamental aspects of the product I'd spent years developing. "It's really complex stuff," Tyler said, looking at me with the kind of condescension that suggested he thought I couldn't possibly understand. "Basically, we help businesses track their inventory in real time using cloud-based architecture and AI integration. And the AI integration part was completely wrong because we'd specifically avoided that overcomplicated approach in favor of a more streamlined system." But I just nodded and asked follow-up questions and let him dig himself deeper into explanations of my own company's technology, while our parents looked at him like he'd invented the internet. My mother reached over and squeezed Tyler's hand and said, "See, Jessica? Tyler just needed the right opportunity. He's thriving now. He's always been such a people person, not like you." And that last part was delivered without malice, just a casual observation that I was somehow less than in the category of human connection, less warm, less charismatic, less worthy of the kind of uncomplicated pride she felt watching Tyler describe a job he barely understood at a company that existed only because I'd worked myself to exhaustion for 7 years. "You're doing okay too, though, right?" my father asked, and it was clearly an afterthought. A polite addition to the Tyler appreciation session. "Still at that startup?" I smiled and said I was doing fine, and Tyler jumped back in with a story about landing a client, except I knew from the sales reports that he'd actually been second assist on a deal that Jennifer Martinez had closed, but he was telling it like he'd single-handedly saved the account, and I watched our parents believe every word and felt something settle in my chest that wasn't quite anger anymore, wasn't quite hurt, was maybe just a quiet certainty that the revelation, when it came, would be all the sweeter for how completely they'd misunderstood everything. 6 months into Tyler's tenure at TechStream Solutions, the comfortable mediocrity he'd settled into started showing cracks, Or maybe the cracks had always been there and were just becoming visible to people who weren't predisposed to make excuses for him. And I watched from my office as he started arriving at 9:15, then 9:30, then sometimes not until after 10 with a coffee cup from the expensive place 2 blocks away, and an easy excuse about traffic that wore thin after the third repetition. He'd started dating Sarah from marketing about a month earlier, and I'd watched that develop with some concern because workplace relationships were allowed under our policies but required disclosure to HR. And I knew from Lauren that Tyler hadn't filed the paperwork, which was a small violation, but telling in its assumption that rules didn't quite apply to him. And Sarah was sharp enough that I wondered what she saw in him, until I realized she probably saw the same carefully constructed facade of confidence and competence that our parents had always bought without question. His sales numbers were mediocre, hovering right around the minimum acceptable performance level, not bad enough to trigger formal review, but not good enough to justify the space he took up. And the thing about being adequate in a company full of exceptional people is that adequate starts to look like underperforming, starts to drag on team morale, starts to make other people wonder why they're working nights and weekends while someone else coasts to the same paycheck. The complaints started coming to Maya in early September. Careful professional observations from other sales team members about Tyler leaving early while they stayed late, about him taking credit for shared work in team meetings, about a client call he'd completely botched by making promises about product features that didn't exist, and Maya brought them to me in her systematic way, with documentation and timestamps, and a question in her eyes about whether I could handle this objectively. I told her to handle it exactly as she would with any other underperforming employee, which meant a documented conversation about expectations and a performance improvement plan if things didn't change. And she met with Tyler in one of the glass-walled conference rooms where I could see but not hear them, and I watched his body language shift from casual to defensive, watched him lean back in his chair with his arms crossed, watched him say something with a little smile that made Maya's expression go very flat and professional. She told me later that he'd been dismissive, had suggested that his performance was fine, and that maybe people were just jealous, had mentioned something vague about knowing people in a way that suggested he thought he had protection he didn't actually have, and I felt something cold settle in my chest at that, because it was so perfectly Tyler, so completely aligned with a lifetime of getting away with mediocrity because someone always ran interference for him. Meanwhile, the company was in the most intense negotiation period of its existence, because a major private equity firm had approached us about acquisition, and the number they were discussing was $85 million, which would mean that my company that I'd started in a dorm room with maxed out credit cards would be valued at a number I couldn't quite process, and I was in back-to-back meetings with lawyers and accountants and the board, sleeping 4 hours a night again, but this time by choice rather than necessity. And Tyler was completely oblivious in his corner of the sales floor, planning a vacation to Cancun with Sarah, and complaining that he couldn't get the time off approved during peak sales quarter. The acquisition deal closed on October 15th, and the final number was $85 million, which meant that my company that I'd started with $12,000 in seed funding and maxed out credit cards was now worth more money than I could quite process. And the board of directors gathered in our largest conference room with champagne that cost more than my first month's rent had been, and toasted to success while I stood there feeling oddly disconnected from the celebration, like I was watching it happen to someone else. The board had one condition for moving forward, which was that I needed to step into the public role of CEO instead of hiding behind Maya and the other executives, needed to be the face of TechStream Solutions at industry events and investor meetings, and the annual company party that was coming up in 3 weeks. And I'd avoided that visibility for years because I told myself it was about work-life balance, but really it was about maintaining the protective distance I'd built between my professional success and my family's complete unawareness of it. "It's time," Maya said to me after the board meeting, sitting in my office with its glass walls that let me see the entire floor, including Tyler's desk where he was scrolling through his phone instead of working. And she was right. I knew she was right. Knew that I couldn't hide forever and wasn't sure I wanted to anymore. The annual company party was scheduled for November 8th at the Grand Harbor Hotel, one of those upscale downtown venues with crystal chandeliers and harbor views, big enough for all 140 employees plus guests. And in previous years, I'd sent Maya or David from product development to give the company a dress while I made an appearance for 20 minutes and left early. But this year would be different. I approved the invitation that went out to all staff 3 weeks before the event, watched it get forwarded and discussed, watched the excitement build about the acquisition announcement that would be made official at the party, and I knew Tyler would be there because he'd mentioned it at the last family dinner I'd attended, had said something about showing his workplace to our parents, about how they'd finally get to see what he'd been building. My mother had called me 2 days later, which was unusual enough that I almost didn't answer. And she'd asked in that casual way that suggested she didn't think it was important whether Tyler mentioned his company is having some fancy party and we're going to see his office. You should come if you're not busy, see where your brother works. And the assumption in that phrasing, the complete certainty that it was Tyler's company, Tyler's office, Tyler's achievement, settled something in my chest that had been unsettled for 7 years. I told her I'd be there, didn't clarify anything, just confirmed that yes, I would attend the party at the Grand Harbor Hotel on November 8th. And after we hung up, I sat in my office looking out at the floor full of people who worked for me at the company I'd built, and felt something that wasn't quite anticipation and wasn't quite dread, was maybe just readiness. I arrived at the Grand Harbor Hotel at 5:30, 90 minutes before the official start time, because I needed that space to settle myself and walk through the venue and remember that this was my event at my company celebrating my achievement, and I'd dressed with deliberate care in a navy silk dress that cost more than my entire wardrobe had been worth in college, with my hair professionally styled and wearing the pearl earrings Maya had given me last year, with a card that said, "For when you're ready to step into the light." And when I walked through the hotel entrance, the event coordinator recognized me immediately and greeted me by name, while two of my senior developers, who'd arrived early to help with the tech setup, looked up from their laptops and smiled with genuine warmth. The ballroom was transformed, with round tables draped in white linens and centerpieces of white roses and soft gold uplighting that made everything glow. And there was a stage at the front with a podium and a screen for the presentation, and I stood there looking at it all and felt the weight of 7 years pressing against my chest. All those nights working 3 jobs and studying until dawn, and eating ramen for the 4th day in a row, and sitting alone at my college graduation while my parents attended Tyler's job interview that he didn't even get. Employees started arriving around 6:15, coming in groups and pairs, dressed up and excited, and they greeted me with easy familiarity because the people who worked directly with me knew exactly who I was, even if I'd kept my public profile low. And I moved through the growing crowd accepting congratulations and answering questions about the acquisition and feeling myself settle into the role I'd been avoiding. And then at 6:45, I saw them. Tyler came through the entrance with our parents flanking him like an honor guard, and my mother was wearing the pearls she saved for special occasions, and my father had on the suit he wore to Tyler's college graduation, and Tyler was gesturing expansively as he led them into the ballroom, pointing at the decor and the bar setup and the stage like he had anything to do with any of it. And they couldn't see me from where I stood near the far wall, partially hidden by a cluster of people from the development team. I watched Tyler give our parents what he clearly thought was a tour, watched him point to the TechStream Solutions logo on the screen and say something that made my father nod approvingly, watched my mother touch his arm with proud affection, and Maya found me there in my hiding spot and said quietly, "You ready for this?" And I realized that I wasn't nervous about the speech or the acquisition announcement or stepping into my public role as CEO. I was nervous about the moment when my parents would finally see me clearly after 25 years of looking through me to focus on Tyler. Not about the business part, I told Maya, and she understood immediately because she'd been there through all of it, had listened to me process years of family dynamics over late-night strategy sessions, had celebrated with me when my parents forgot my birthday for the third year in a row, and I'd finally stopped expecting anything different. "They're going to see you now," Maya said, and she squeezed my hand once and then stepped away as the catering manager signaled that cocktail hour was beginning and the bartenders took their positions and the party officially started. Cocktail hour was in full swing by 7 o'clock, and I positioned myself near the windows with a group of senior engineers, close enough to observe my family, but far enough that they wouldn't notice me unless they were looking. And I watched Tyler hold court at a table near the bar, with our parents seated on either side of him, like bookends. Watched him gesture animatedly while talking to Jordan from sales and Christine from client services, who had both stopped by their table, and even from this distance I could see he was performing, could recognize the expansive hand movements and the confident posture that I'd seen him use at family dinners when he was exaggerating his accomplishments or inflating his role in team projects. My father was nodding along with whatever Tyler was saying, that expression of paternal pride on his face that I'd seen directed at my brother countless times, but couldn't recall ever being aimed at me. And my mother kept touching Tyler's shoulder the way she did when she was particularly pleased with him. And I heard her voice carry across the room during a lull in the ambient conversation saying, "We always knew you'd find the right fit eventually." And Tyler was saying something about company culture and his contributions to recent sales growth, even though his numbers were in the bottom third of the sales team. Sarah Chen from marketing was standing a few feet away from their table talking to David from product development. And I saw the moment when she glanced over at Tyler and our parents, saw her eyebrows raise slightly when she overheard whatever Tyler was saying, and she caught my eye across the room with an expression that was part disbelief and part secondhand embarrassment, because Sarah knew exactly who I was, had been in the meetings where I'd presented the acquisition strategy and negotiated terms with the board. My mother's voice rose again, and this time I heard her clearly say, "Jessica is doing fine too, I suppose. She has some office job with computers," with that dismissive tone that suggested my career was adequate but unremarkable, certainly nothing compared to Tyler's position at this clearly successful company. And my father added something I couldn't quite hear, but that made Tyler laugh and lean back in his chair with satisfaction. The irony of them sitting in my ballroom at my event, celebrating my company's acquisition, while crediting Tyler for finding success, would have been funny if it didn't make my chest feel tight with 7 years of accumulated dismissals. At 7:25, the lights dimmed slightly and Maya stepped up to the microphone on stage, and the room gradually quieted as people found their seats or turned their attention toward the front. And I stayed where I was near the windows while Maya tapped the microphone twice and said, "Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for being here." And Tyler was sitting up straighter now, adjusting his tie, and I saw him try to catch Maya's eye like they were colleagues who knew each other well, even though they'd maybe exchanged 10 words in the 6 months he'd worked here. Maya's voice carried clearly through the sound system as she thanked everyone for coming and acknowledged what an incredible year it had been for TechStream Solutions, and she spoke with the polished confidence that made her such an effective COO, discussing how the company had grown from 15 employees to over 80 in just 18 months, and how the client base had expanded across 3 continents, and how the acquisition they were celebrating tonight represented not just financial success, but validation of the innovative approach that had set TechStream apart from competitors. Tyler was clapping enthusiastically, his applause just slightly too loud and too eager, and I watched him lean forward in his seat like he was trying to make eye contact with Maya, trying to establish some visible connection that would signal to our parents that he was more than just a junior sales associate, that he was someone important here, someone recognized by the leadership team. My mother was beaming at him with unrestrained pride, and my father had that satisfied expression he wore when Tyler did something that confirmed his belief in my brother's potential, and they were sitting in those chairs completely convinced that they were here because of Tyler, that his success had earned them this invitation to this elegant event at this beautiful venue. Maya was talking about company values now, about merit and innovation, and the courage to take risks, and she mentioned how TechStream had been built on the principle that talent and hard work mattered more than connections or credentials, that everyone in this room had earned their place through contribution and dedication. And I saw Tyler nod along like he exemplified these values, even though his performance reviews showed consistent mediocrity, and I'd personally read 3 separate complaints from team members about him coasting on group efforts. "We're here tonight because of one person's vision," Maya said, and the room was completely quiet now, everyone's attention focused on the stage, and I straightened slightly where I stood near the windows, feeling my heart rate pick up, even though I'd known this moment was coming, had planned for it, had chosen it deliberately. 7 years ago, she was a college student working 3 jobs and building the first version of our flagship product in her dorm room, Maya continued. And I saw my mother's expression shift slightly, saw a flicker of confusion cross her face, like something about this narrative was triggering a half-formed recognition she couldn't quite grasp. And she took a risk that most people wouldn't take, turning down safe job offers to build something new, something better, something that would change how small businesses manage their operations. Tyler was still clapping, still oblivious, but my father had gone very still in his chair. "And now, please welcome the person who made all this possible, our founder and CEO, Jessica Clark." The spotlight swung to me, and the room erupted in applause, and I started walking toward the stage, and in my peripheral vision, I saw Tyler's face freeze mid-clap, saw his hands stop moving like someone had pressed pause on a video, saw his expression shift from proud confidence to absolute confusion. And my mother's hand flew to her mouth, and my father's drink slipped from his fingers and hit the table with a dull thud that I heard even over the applause, and I walked past their table close enough to see the shock in their eyes, close enough to see 7 years of dismissal colliding with the reality standing in front of them in a navy silk dress and pearl earrings, close enough to see everything change. I reached the stage and took the microphone from Maya's hand, feeling the weight of 80 pairs of eyes on me and the particular burning intensity of 3 sets of eyes at that table near the bar, and I took a breath and said, "Thank you all for being here tonight," keeping my voice steady and professional, the voice I'd developed over 7 years of investor pitches and client presentations and board meetings. And I looked out at the room full of people who had chosen to work for this company, who had believed in the vision enough to contribute their talent and time and energy to building something meaningful. 7 years ago, I was living in a dorm room at university, working as a tutor during the day and coding at night, surviving on coffee and the kind of optimism that only comes from not knowing how hard things are going to get. And I saw a few people in the audience smile with recognition, because some of them had been there in those early days when we were 5 people in a shared office space, with furniture from Craigslist, and more ambition than funding. I was working 3 jobs to pay for my education because I didn't have family money to fall back on. And I didn't look at my parents when I said it, but I felt the words land at their table like stones. And I learned something important during those years. Something that became the foundation of what we built here, which is that your circumstances don't define your potential, and your background doesn't determine your worth. The room was absolutely silent now, everyone listening, and I continued. TechStream Solutions was built on the principle that merit matters, that hard work matters, that innovation and dedication and genuine contribution are what create success, not connections or credentials or family name. And I was speaking to everyone, but I was also speaking to 3 people specifically, telling them in professional language what I'd never been able to say at family dinners or holiday gatherings, or the rare occasions when I'd tried to share my achievements and been met with distraction or dismissal. This acquisition we're celebrating tonight represents an $85 million valuation, but more importantly, it represents validation of an approach, proof that betting on talent and believing in people who are willing to work hard and take risks can create something extraordinary. And I announced that every employee would be receiving both a cash bonus and stock options, that their contributions were being recognized not just with words, but with tangible rewards, and the room erupted in applause and genuine excitement, people turning to congratulate each other and celebrate together. I let the moment breathe, let people enjoy the news, and then I brought the attention back by saying, "But more than the financial success, I'm proud of the culture we've built here, the values we've maintained, the commitment to evaluating people based on what they contribute rather than who they know or where they came from." And Tyler was sitting completely motionless at his table, his face pale, and my mother had tears running down her cheeks, and my father was staring at me like he was seeing me for the first time in his life. Thank you all for making this possible, for believing in this company, for being the kind of team that turns vision into reality. And I raised the glass of champagne that someone had placed on the podium. Here's to the next chapter. And the room rose to its feet in a standing ovation that washed over me like vindication. Like 7 years of 18-hour days and ramen dinners and sleeping on office couches finally being recognized. And I stood there accepting it, not with triumph, but with the quiet satisfaction of knowing I had built this myself, had earned every bit of it, had proven that I never needed their college fund, or their approval, or their belief to become exactly who I was always capable of being. The applause faded gradually as I stepped down from the stage and immediately found myself surrounded by employees who wanted to congratulate me or ask questions about the stock options or simply express their excitement about the acquisition. And I moved through these conversations with the professional warmth I'd cultivated over years of networking events and client dinners, thanking people genuinely while keeping one eye on the corner where Tyler and my parents had huddled together in what was clearly an intense whispered conversation. My mother's face was blotchy with tears, and my father kept shaking his head like he was trying to reorganize reality into something that made sense, and Tyler was gesturing sharply with his hands in that way he did when he was upset and trying to make a point, and I could see other employees glancing in their direction with curiosity because their body language screamed family drama in the middle of what was supposed to be a celebration. I was talking with David from the development team about the technical challenges we'd overcome in the third quarter when I saw Sarah approaching from across the room, Tyler's girlfriend from the marketing department. And her expression was apologetic and uncomfortable in a way that made it clear she was about to have an awkward conversation. "Jessica, I'm so sorry," she said when she reached me, and David took the hint and excused himself diplomatically. "I had no idea you were Tyler's sister, he never mentioned it, and if I'd known I would have said something before tonight because some of the things he said about the company and about his role here have been—" She trailed off, clearly uncertain how to finish that sentence without betraying my brother completely. I touched her arm gently and said, "Sarah, Tyler's employment here is completely separate from any family relationship. He was hired through the standard process, and he's evaluated by the same metrics as everyone else. And whatever happens between him and me as family members doesn't affect his position here as long as his performance meets company standards." And I meant it because I'd worked too hard to build a company based on merit to let nepotism corrupt it, even when the nepotism would work against someone rather than for them. Sarah nodded, looking relieved, and she said, "He's a nice guy, but he sometimes gives the impression that he's more connected to leadership than he actually is, and I just wanted you to know that some of us in marketing have noticed." And I thanked her for her honesty and told her that performance management was an ongoing process for all employees, and she squeezed my hand and disappeared back into the crowd just as I saw my parents detach from Tyler and start walking toward me with hesitant steps. They looked smaller somehow than they had looked from the stage, diminished by the reality of what they were finally understanding, and my father reached me first and said, "Jessica," in a voice I'd never heard from him before, uncertain and almost pleading. "We didn't know. We had no idea you had built all this." And the words hung in the air between us, heavy with 7 years of not asking, not wondering, not bothering to find out what their daughter had been doing while they focused all their attention on their son. I looked at him directly and said, "You never asked," keeping my voice level and factual rather than accusatory, because I'd learned that the truth spoken plainly was more powerful than anger. And my mother made a sound like a sob and reached out to hug me. But I stepped back politely and said, "This isn't the place," gesturing to the room full of employees who were trying not to watch while absolutely watching. And then Tyler appeared at their shoulders with his face flushed red and his jaw clenched tight, and I knew that whatever happened next was going to be the real confrontation, the moment where 7 years of hidden resentment and current humiliation collided. Tyler pushed past our parents with his face red and his hands clenched at his sides and said, "This is unbelievable, Jessica. You set me up. You humiliated me in front of the entire company, in front of my girlfriend. You brought mom and dad here just to embarrass me." And his voice was rising with each word, drawing more attention from employees who were trying to pretend they weren't listening while absolutely listening to every word. I kept my voice level and quiet, forcing him to either calm down or look more unreasonable by contrast, and said, "Tyler, I didn't arrange for you to apply here. I didn't manipulate the hiring process. You submitted your resume through the standard channels, and you were evaluated by HR and the sales team leadership without any input from me. You earned this position on your own merit." And I watched his face as he processed that, because part of him wanted to be angry, but another part of him recognized that what I was saying was true. "You should have told me," he said, and his voice cracked slightly on the last word. "You should have told me you owned the company, that you were the CEO. You let me walk around here for 6 months not knowing I was working for my own sister." And I looked at him directly and asked, "Why, Tyler, would you have treated the CEO differently than you treated your sister?" And the question hung in the air between us like an accusation, because we both knew the answer. We both knew that he'd dismissed me and overlooked me and explained my own company's products to me incorrectly at that family dinner because he'd never taken me seriously, never saw me as someone important or successful or worth his respect. My mother stepped forward and tried to say something placating, tried to smooth things over the way she'd always smoothed over family conflicts by pretending they didn't exist or weren't serious. But I held up my hand and said, "No, Mom, we're going to talk about this. We're going to acknowledge what happened because I've spent 7 years not saying anything, and I'm done with that." And my father looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. I turned to face both of them fully and said, "You gave my college fund to Tyler when I was 18 years old. You missed my graduation ceremony because Tyler had a job interview. You converted my bedroom into a gaming room during my freshman year of college. You've spent 7 years asking about Tyler's life, and barely asking about mine. And tonight you stood in my company believing you were here to celebrate Tyler's success without ever wondering what I had been doing with my life." And I wasn't shouting, wasn't crying, was just stating facts in chronological order, like I was presenting a case to investors. My mother was crying openly now, and my father had gone pale, and Tyler was looking between them and me like he was finally understanding something he'd never considered before. And I could see Maya in my peripheral vision, standing ready to intervene if needed, but I signaled subtly that I was fine, because I was fine. I was finally saying things that needed to be said, in a place where there were witnesses and consequences, and no one could pretend later that the conversation hadn't happened, or that I was being oversensitive or remembering things wrong. I looked at the three of them standing there in the middle of my company's celebration, and felt something shift inside me. Not anger exactly, but a kind of clarity that came from finally saying things that had lived in my chest for 7 years. And I took a breath and said, "I need you to understand something, all three of you. I'm not angry anymore. I was angry for a long time, but I'm not now, because the truth is that everything you did, every time you overlooked me, or dismissed my achievements, or gave Tyler what should have been mine, it taught me that I couldn't rely on anyone but myself, and that lesson made me who I am today." My mother was shaking her head like she wanted to deny this narrative, but I continued before she could interrupt and said, "I didn't need your college fund to get my education. I didn't need your approval to build this company. I didn't need your recognition to know my own worth, and while it hurt at the time, while there were nights during college when I was working until 3 in the morning and eating ramen for the fourth day in a row, and I resented that Tyler had it easy, those experiences gave me something more valuable than comfort. They gave me resilience and determination and the absolute certainty that anything I achieved was mine because I earned it. I turned to Tyler specifically and said, "You can keep your job here if your performance improves to meet company standards, but you need to understand that at work I'm your CEO, not your sister. There's no special treatment in either direction. You'll be evaluated on the same metrics as everyone else, and you'll succeed or fail based on your own merit." And I watched him struggle with that. Saw the impulse to argue warring with a new understanding that maybe the world didn't owe him anything just for showing up. Then I addressed my parents directly and said, "I'm open to having a relationship with you, but it has to be on different terms than before. It has to include mutual respect and equal treatment and an acknowledgement of what happened in the past, not just sweeping it under the rug and pretending everything was always fine." And my mother started to say, "Jessica, we're so sorry, we never meant to make you feel..." But I held up my hand and said, "I know you didn't mean it. That's almost worse than if you'd done it deliberately, because it means I was so far off your radar that you hurt me without even noticing." My father finally spoke, his voice rough, and said, "What can we do to make this right?" And I told him honestly, "I don't know if you can make it right, but you can start by actually seeing me, by asking about my life, by treating Tyler and me as equally worthy of your attention and support, and by understanding that I built all of this without you, and I don't need you to validate it, but I would like to share it with you if you can show up as real participants in my life instead of distant observers." Tyler made a frustrated sound and said, "This is ridiculous. I don't have to stand here and be lectured." And he turned and walked toward the exit, and my parents looked between him and me, clearly torn, and my mother said, "We should go after him, but Jessica, please, can we talk more about this? Can we sit down somewhere private?" I nodded and said, "Come to my office next Tuesday. 1 o'clock, we'll talk then. But right now, I have employees to celebrate with, and you should probably take Tyler home." And my father touched my arm gently and said, "I'm proud of you. I know I should have said that years ago, but I'm saying it now. I'm proud of what you've built." And the words landed strangely because I'd wanted to hear them for so long. But now that I finally had them, they felt less important than I'd imagined, less necessary to my sense of self-worth. They left together, following Tyler's path toward the exit, and Maya appeared at my elbow immediately and pulled me into a hug and asked, "How do you feel?" And I leaned into her shoulder for just a moment, let myself feel the weight and release of the confrontation, and then I straightened up and said, "Free? I feel free." And I meant it because I'd finally said everything that needed saying, and whatever happened next with my family would happen from a place of honest foundation, rather than unspoken resentment. 3 months passed, and I sat in my office on a Tuesday afternoon, watching through the glass partition as Tyler worked at his desk in the sales department. And something fundamental had changed in him since the night of the company party, because he was actually working now instead of coasting, actually listening to the senior sales team instead of dismissing their advice, actually staying until end of business instead of slipping out early. And his numbers had improved enough that Maya mentioned it during our weekly operations meeting without any prompting from me. He'd found a mentor in Robert Chen, one of our top sales executives, and I'd see them having lunch together in the break room while Robert walked him through client relationship strategies, and Tyler took actual notes instead of nodding along while thinking about something else. And twice in the past month, Tyler had stopped by my office to ask professional questions about company direction or product specifications, awkward conversations where we both pretended the years of family dysfunction didn't exist and focused entirely on business. And it wasn't comfortable exactly, but it was functional and honest in a way our family interactions had never been. My parents and I met for lunch once a month now, at a restaurant equidistant from my office and their home, careful neutral territory where we were rebuilding something that resembled a relationship on completely different foundations than before. And my mother cried during our second lunch and apologized formally for every specific instance I'd mentioned at the party, and several more she'd remembered since, while my father sat quiet and uncomfortable, but present in a way he'd never been during my childhood. They'd offered during that same lunch to pay back the college fund amount plus interest. My mother sliding a check across the table with $73,000 written in her careful handwriting. And I'd looked at it for a long moment before sliding it back and saying, I didn't need their money now and never wanted them to think they could pay for absolution. But if they wanted to do something meaningful, they could donate to the university's scholarship fund for first-generation and low-income students. And 2 weeks later, I received a letter from my alma mater thanking me because my parents had established an annual scholarship in my name that would put a full-ride student through the business program every year. TechStream Solutions continued growing, and we'd hired 40 new employees since the acquisition and opened a second office in Austin. And Maya was planning our expansion into the European market while I focused on product development and the parts of running a company that I actually enjoyed instead of the parts I'd forced myself to do when survival required it. And for the first time since founding the company, I was paying myself an actual salary, and I'd bought an apartment in a building with a doorman and windows that overlooked the city, and I was learning slowly to enjoy the success I'd built, instead of just using it as armor against old wounds. I kept a photograph on my desk in a simple silver frame, the picture that Maya's mother had taken at my college graduation 7 years ago, me in cap and gown standing between Maya and her parents and her little sister, all of them beaming at the camera while I smiled with relief and exhaustion and determination. And sometimes during long afternoons, I'd look at that photograph and remember the girl who'd worked 3 jobs and slept 4 hours a night and refused to ask for help because she'd learned that help wouldn't come. And I'd feel grateful to her for everything she'd endured and proud of her for never giving up, and sad for her that she'd had to fight so hard for things that should have been freely given. But I'd also feel grateful for what that struggle had taught me about my own strength and capacity and worth, lessons I might never have learned if things had come easy. And I'd built something real and valuable and entirely mine through years of work that nobody could diminish or take away or claim credit for. And that knowledge lived in my chest like a foundation that couldn't be shaken by anyone's approval or disapproval. Tyler would probably never be an exceptional employee, but he was becoming an adequate one who showed up and tried and accepted feedback. And maybe that was enough. Maybe we could build some kind of civil relationship based on mutual professional respect, even if we'd never have the close sibling bond that some families took for granted. And my parents would probably never fully understand the impact of their years of dismissal. But they were trying in their limited way to acknowledge it and make different choices. And I was learning that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting or pretending things hadn't happened, but rather meant refusing to let past pain consume present possibility. Maya knocked on my office door and stuck her head in to say the product development team was ready for our 4 o'clock meeting, and I saved the document I'd been working on, and stood up and grabbed my laptop and followed her down the hall toward the conference room. And as I walked through my company, past employees who nodded hello and respected my leadership and valued my vision, I felt something I'd been reaching toward for 7 years finally settle into place, a sense of completion that had nothing to do with my family's recognition and everything to do with knowing absolutely that I'd built this myself, that every success and achievement and moment of pride was genuinely earned through my own work and determination and vision. And that was enough. That would always be enough, no matter what anyone else thought or said or believed about my worth.